So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We're very happy to hold this event under the Social Justice and Development Policy in the Arab World program at the Issam Institute. This is a program that's been going for about a year, and we are looking at social justice issues in the region to understand what people mean when they say we want social justice. And people are demonstrating, dying in many cases for achieving social justice, and we feel we need to understand that better in terms of what are the component elements of social justice and what are the recommendations that we can make to governments and private sector and NGOs, educators, etc., about the social justice realities in this region. And we've been working on a program for 3-4 years ahead, which we're doing jointly with the Bob Center for Peace and Justice at Princeton University, headed by Amani Jamal, and we're funded by the Bob Foundation in the United States, as well as by AUB and IFI. So we are very happy to hold this event with Bruce Currie-Alder. Bruce is a colleague and a friend, but he's here today mainly because he produced with 3 other co-editors this extraordinary book about international development. This is my dream as a writer. When I was a young writer starting out, I used to be paid by the word, and this is a 900-page book. So I imagine how much I could have gotten paid for writing all these words. But of course, this is not the work of one person. There's 52 chapters in it, and it is a comprehensive analysis of developmental theory and practice and experience and outcomes and obstacles and paradigms and everything you ever want to know about development. The title is International Development, Ideas, Experience, and Prospects. And the book is published by Oxford University Press. Just for the record, the co-editors are Bruce Currie-Alder, Ravi Kanbor, David Malone, and Rohinton Medora. And Bruce will talk for about 30, maybe 40 minutes about why they did this book, the main lessons of the book, some comments on the relationship of these lessons to social justice and to development. And I've asked him to add a few words from his experience and IDRC's experience about the implications of all this, as well as his experience as IDRC regional director, the implications for research centers like IFI, universities like AUB, individual researchers, etc. There's some seats around here, so people who are standing up can grab a seat if you want. There's one there and a couple here, so don't be shy, come and grab a seat. And then we will have comments by Dr. Samir Metnasi, Professor Emeritus of Economics with a long history in developmental work in government, in international organizations, and probably in many NGOs over his lifetime, and in academia as well. So Samir will give some comments. He's our faculty research advisor on the social justice program. And after his comments, we will then have an open discussion, and we're very much looking forward to that. Thank you all for coming, and Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that. Let me begin just stating what is Canada's IDRC. The International Development Research Centre is basically a research funding organization. We don't necessarily do our own work. I lead the regional office in Cairo, responsible for our programming across the Arabic-speaking world, Morocco to the Gulf. And its vision at the moment is to be supporting knowledge, innovation, solutions that improve the lives of people in the developing world. Our main programs are agriculture and the environment, social and economic policy, technology and innovation. My own career began with a sort of frustration over sustainability, or the lack thereof. I'm trained in the environmental sciences. And then when I finished my first degree, I felt the science is there, but the policy in action often is not. And that began a career trajectory that's taken me through natural resource management and public policy and to where I am now. Let me speak today about the book and beyond the book, if you will. So some of the ideas that I will be sharing with you are found in the volume, some of them more from the reactions and ideas that have come out afterwards. And I will freely attribute much of what I will be saying not is my own ideas, but also those of my co-editors. So Rohinti Medora, who's currently president of the Center for International Governance Innovation, David Malone, who is UNU Rector, United Nations University, and Ravi Kambor, who actually was an intellectual leader for all of us at Cornell University. So in some ways, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and their ideas are weaved into my own and what I'll be saying here. Just to comment on Ravi's point, I wish I'd thought of that. Actually, we're not getting any royalties out of this whatsoever. We were not paid by the word. Indeed, we were not paid. We did a Faustian bargain, if you will. We were able to negotiate with the press, being able to have the full text freely available online, which is the website you see behind me, developmentideas.info. And the price for that was, we said, well, we'll forego all royalties and what have you, and to try to keep the price point as low as possible to improve the access to development. What will I speak about today? Ravi's already given the beginning of it, but essentially, what have we learned about development policy? What have we learned about changes in thinking and practice, or how to influence policy, if you will? And in that, make some reference to models of success that we've seen, and situate it, where does this call for social justice and attention to inequality fit today? And then conclude with the implications for MENA. One of the titles that was circulating, I cheekily called the sort of the end of development, the beginning of history, and I'll explain why. So let me begin. The overview of the book. We chose, the co-editors and I, 50 different topics that we thought were essential to international development. And we went out to find key thinkers and practitioners on these particular topics, and we gave them a triple challenge. We said, in 8,000 words, give us how thinking on this topic has evolved. What have been some of the key ideas? Where did they come from? What were key changes in how we have been thinking about these topics? And then what are the implications for that moving forward? Our point of entry is international development, not foreign aid. If I can be provocative, and in a university audience I think I should be, I think the era of foreign aid has now been bookended. If one can point to 1949 and President Truman's Point 4 speech as launching the modern era of foreign aid, I think 2008, when we started thinking about this volume, which was the financial crisis, you saw the West becoming increasingly inwardly focused, in many ways marked the end of it, well ahead of the 2015 agenda that we're currently debating now. I say that international development is a larger concept. What was our entry point was really thinking about how societies change over time. And our inspiration we took from Bellin and Cox, who wrote a volume on ideas in social sciences. And I'll just briefly mention a quote from their volume. This is 2011. What things change and how they change are all the result of what people choose to do. These choices are shaped by the ideas people hold and debate. So, in the words of Ravi, our volume really looks at the co-evolution of thinking and practice, how ideas inspire different strategies, actions towards development, but then the facts on the ground, the experience of implementing these ideas in practice, then fed back in, and in some cases forced us to rethink what we mean by international development. So the experiences of places and institutions comes through strongly. Indeed, the last third of the volume is about the experience of real-life countries and organizations, not abstract topics, if you will. This is the entry point for my first takeaway. One of the key things we've learned through this volume is that you do not see a sort of Kuhnian sense of scientific revolutions, that there was one paradigm of international development and that was completely substituted by a new theory. what you see is rather an accumulation of ideas, theories, and concepts over time, such that when you're talking about international development today, you can freely recite Adam Smith and Amartya Sen, despite the fact that there are centuries between these two authors. Their ideas are still influencing, and we're still understanding real-life facts on the ground through those lenses. If we look back, some of the key things that are come out in the volume is that there's actually been a tremendous amount of progress or success, however you want to understand it. It is indisputable that world poverty has fallen tremendously over the 20th century and into the early 21st. There's been tremendous gains in material well-being for most of the people in the world. The overall theme, if you had to summarize it into what a lot of the development experience of the 20th century and into the 21st has been, is about overcoming scarcity and generating wealth. And early on in this volume, we realized that we were trying to address a gap between three academic solitudes, if you will: the development economists, the international relations folks, and the development studies folks. So we really tried to aim for the sweet spot between those to create a volume that would be useful for all of them. You also see over these 60, 70 years, broadening notions of how success is described and what is being developed. So you go back to the 50s, and it was all about infrastructure, national economic growth, the economy. Then we've gotten into these discourses of reducing poverty, improving health, improving ecological sustainability, good governance, and more recently security has been high on these agendas. So these broadening notions of what success looks like and what is being developed, not just industrialization, but the idea of, again, well-being, equity, and more recently human freedom as concepts. So when people say, well, development hasn't succeeded, it's because in part the metrics of success have been broadening and growing out. Another sort of shift that one sees is the move from big development to small development. Go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of thinking on development was grand historical narratives of how societies are changing. More recently, we have this world of small development, modest changes in the well-being or what matters to individuals and groups within society rather than wholesale social change. A certain amount of the positive shift one has seen in the social sciences are also reflected in international development. That development seen as one experiment at a time rather than grand plans, and this admiration for quantified targets. If one can sort of say what the mindset has been, the sort of economic modeling and clinical medicine as paradigms for how one is thinking about the changes in the lives of the poor. We've seen the Millennium Development Goals. We've seen this sort of relative success of cash transfers as basically giving money to the poor to alleviate their needs. There's also this sort of turn or return to thinking in development that's informed by technology, engineering, and design, business thinking, the idea of goods and services that are being marketed to the bottom of the pyramid. And if I can jump ahead, that idea of overcoming scarcity and generating wealth is slowly permutating into the headline of how do we live well amidst relative plenty. That we do have this bizarre situation where there is still hunger and malnutrition, but we also have to worry about non-communicable diseases and malnutrition at the same time, obesity. So we move beyond income poverty. We are now concerned about multiple dimensions of human well-being, health, education, living standards. At the same time, we're seeing, even in this very sort of small development world, the revenge of the hard issues, if you will, those that are more grounded in power, politics, and questions of human freedom, illicit trade, drugs, weapons, what have you, sexual violence, organized crimes. You know, these are not things that are necessarily subjective to impact evaluation. They're messy issues. Beyond poverty per se, we also have to be worried about those who are, still not that well off and vulnerable to shocks. One knock to the Egyptian economy can knock a bunch of people back into poverty. So it's not a one-way path by any means. Looking forward, we're in an interesting moment of history where we're in the middle of one wave and about to experience another. What we're experiencing right now is this divergence between poor places and poor people. So we've had 60 years where we've thought about poor countries, but if you look at where the majority of the world's poor are right now, they're actually middle-income countries. And we haven't had a set of principles, paradigms, programs that really understand that well. That's the reality today, where a lot of attention is being paid to India, China, certain states in Africa. Some projections, however, say that that's a temporary phenomenon, that within another 30 years, we'll be facing a reality where up to half of the world's income poor will be in 10 African states. Now, that is a tremendously different world that we'll be facing, and it asks us, what are we all trying to do about this? One of the questions that comes out in either of these paradigms is what is happening to the middle class? You know, we've spent so much time asking what's happening to those living in poverty, but that middle class that may be growing or eroding depending on which country you're looking at, what happens there matters. And to the extent that they're increasing their reliance on remittances or migration, really speaks to an important motor of development independently of what's happening to the poorest in society. Other insights, it's very clear that we're at a moment when a lot of what's happening in development is both beyond and beneath the Westphalian nation state, if you will. So questions of global governance, how states interact with each other to produce the context for development to happen, and what's happening to populations left behind within the borders. Interesting mapping within the country of Chile, central Chile, one sub-region, identified different counties, so almost rural populations, that have poverty and human development indicators on par with Switzerland and with Swaziland, separated by 70 kilometers. So if you've had that diversity within national borders, how meaningful are international comparisons these days? If I can be, again, provocative, and this is where I come in with my own ideas, I think very much we're at a moment when the phrase international development may soon be extinct and replaced. If we look back at the phrase natural philosophy that pre-existed before the modern multiplicity of modern sciences, international development has reached a stretching point. I mentioned the broadening categorizations of it. And if I can identify three that may be useful or may not, but I find them so. First is really the question of domestic public policy. You know, what is the use of national wealth to look after our citizens? And that's very much my decision as Canadians or Lebanese. You know, how do we look after ourselves? These questions that fall within the gamut of the nation state still. The second category are the cross-border ones, the ones that obviously you need cooperation across nation states, whether it's international pollution, migration, coordination to produce public goods of different sorts. And on this, I'm glad to see Dr. Emmanuel in the room. I mean, public health obviously covers both of these, both national and cross-border. Third would be the truly foreign poverty hotspots. You know, what do we do about those conflict-ridden, ungoverned spaces abroad? So the sort of shorthand for this, if you will, are these tearing apart of international development into issues that are sovereign, common, and truly foreign, or mine, ours, and theirs if you get foreign leaders together. In the time I have remaining, I'd like to address the second topic. You know, what have we learned about changes in thinking and practice, or how is policy influenced? And here I'm intertwining a bit of IDRC's experience and a little bit of what you see in the volume. Essentially, if I can give the short headline version, I think you can identify three different models, if you will. The first and perhaps well-known, and the one that we always feel like we're forced to speak about at the end of a report, is the what to do the model of the policy recommendation. This should be implemented by government. And for examples of success, you don't have to go much further than campus here. I mean, the championing of tobacco control measures by this university and in Lebanon is a fantastic example of that. How could you have certain measures in legislation requiring plain packaging, certain limitations on where you can smoke in public, raising taxes? There's a very well-known set of policy tools that can be followed here. If I can point to what are probably the greatest moments of success for IDRC as well, have been those times when we've been ahead of the curve, when there's been a forthcoming transition in government, and giving folks an opportunity to think through what they want to do once they're in power. Half of Nelson Mandela's cabinet when South Africa reconvened after apartheid were former IDRC grantees. Similarly for Chile after the dark period there. So giving people a chance to think through today, what are the policies they would like what to do tomorrow is also fair game. I said 3 models. The second one is perhaps the older one, the sort of how to do. And this is where you get sort of models of technology, pilot approaches that might later be adapted or scaled up. Examples from IDRC's history have been working with the government of Tanzania for improved monitoring of the burden of disease, to be able to ensure that clinics were stocked with what they needed to address that, not assuming that every rural community was the same. And that led to a 40% reduction in child mortality over the decade. Other examples, more recently, is working with the Sudanese Ministry of Agriculture to develop an improved plow that ends up preparing the land for sorghum planting in a way that actually reduces the need for water. And that's now being marketed and mass-produced with a company in Turkey. So starting with the technology, piloting it, and then taking it to scale. Examples of this, perhaps, here in Lebanon is the work now of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Working from the ground level, how does one ensure that the governance of oil and gas sector is accountable and benefits all of society? Not easy, but Sami Atala and his team are doing fantastic work in that area. The third model, and this is old but often forgotten about, but this is a great place to talk about it, is the how to understand model, if you will. Carol Weiss, back in the 70s, pointed out that this is a form of policy influence. If you can actually change the language or ideas by which public policy issues are understood, talked about, perceived, that itself is a form of shaping the debate. So the sense-making model of informing citizens, enhancing policy literacy and numeracy. And again, I would point to what this university is already doing with the Knowledge to Policy Center that's been established and new work that's going to be looking at creating a rapid response system with the Ministry of Public Health. Very much adapting a model that's proven useful with Makerere University in Uganda. Being able to rally the evidence in a short period of time to make sure that Parliament knows what's going on, how to think through these issues, and what is the most effective approaches. This then begs the question, what role is there for civil society, academia, those of us that spend our time thinking, if you will, and doing? Here, this is an idea that's coming from me, but inspired by others I've encountered, is that perhaps we need to spend more time of thinking of where do we fit in terms of society's function of problem solving and sense making. We spent so much time on how well known am I, how visible am I, how many tweets am I getting, but what really matters if one looks at a network of problem solving and sense making in society is not the nodes. It's not how important is IDRC or UB. It's the linkages. Who are we connected to? How strong are those connections? And how is there a flow of problem solving and sense making in society? We can point to the literature very established in political economy about building coalitions and the importance of that. as a mode. It also suggests that as research organizations, as civil society and academia, we need to make critical choices, trade-offs occasionally between sort of speaking to ourselves and speaking to others. Between, what is the degree of advocacy we're seeking in our work? What is the scale of questions that we're addressing? And what type of expertise and knowledge are we rallying to that? Is it seen as legitimate and credible? So essentially, if we see ourselves as part of this function of problem solving and sense making in society, we need to be thinking about an agenda that is of interest to an outside audience. Who is it that is able to act with the insights we generate? It's not sufficient to just say, I have so many great publications, but how is that making a difference in the world? The nature of communication, many people talked about how the tweet and infographics are now more influential than an academic citation or number of papers. If I can draw on Amartya Sen again, a little known paper of his from the mid-2000s, very modestly called How Development Happens. And in it he refers to democracy and research essentially as government or learning by discussion. And I thought that was a great phrase, and it should be clear that Amartya Sen was a little bit of a hero to all of us as we were putting this together. We were honored by his forward. But what does by discussion mean? It asks us, who are we in dialogue with as we're generating these insights about development? And what comes out of that over time? This came through particularly in some of the latter chapters and in some of the workshops towards the end of preparing this volume. We were honored by having Ricardo Lagos at a final workshop for the book, and he was reflecting on his experience in Chile about trying to improve services, electrification, health, what have you, in rural areas. And this question of working with citizens, being able to not only just provide the services, but also realize that there's a responsibility to pay for, maintain them over time. And then also the question of establishing a dialogue within government across political parties, such that I may be in power today, but if I respect the opposition and have a dialogue with them, then tomorrow when I'm out of power, I will have a better say in what happens. And maybe some of the good policies that are introduced under my regime will continue. That ability to maintain dialogue within government and beyond, if you will. Where does this sort of come back to the questions of social justice and equality, if you will? Again, I said there was a bookend. I think we're now at the sort of end of development in some ways. And where that comes through clearly, I think, are in these calls for social justice and inequality. I see it's very fundamentally linked, the sort of Arab Spring movement of a number of years ago, and the Occupy movement. Both of them have this sort of knee-jerk, instinctive reaction against growing inequality. The big question for me is, do people feel like they are a part of society or a part from society? What is that social contract, if you will? And quite frankly, being trained in environmental sciences, knowing a bit about political public policy, I'm fairly new to this concept, but I've been trying to do a little bit of understanding and unpacking. And when you look at some definitions of social justice, it seems to point to how people react to the social experience, out of their moral sense of what's right and wrong. And that sense of what's right or wrong is socially constructed. If you grow up in Lebanon or Canada, you may have a slightly different set of things. Yet what's interesting is, what type of justice are we talking about? Unpacking it. And some of the literature points to different forms of justice, whether it's obviously distributed, who gets what, the questions of equity, equality, need. There's definitely a strong element of that, whether it's on the streets of New York or Cairo. Yet there's also elements of procedural justice, being treated fairly, how is authority established and exercised, how are institutions treating people. And there's obviously an element of retributive justice, enforcing the rules, punishing those that have done wrong in some sense, compensating victims of a violation, but within limits. Turning back to some of the elements that are touched upon by the book, and I'm borrowing from Ravi Kambor's analysis here, is these two principles, if you will. There's John Rawls' theory of justice, of saying, fairness is if you establish a social contract behind a veil of ignorance, and then, if you didn't know where you fit in society, do you think it's a fair deal? And then whether it's race, gender, income level, however you fit into society, you're fine with those set of rules. So that question of a theory of justice. If we go back to Amartya Sen for a moment, he sort of critiqued and enriched that with his idea of justice, saying, well, it's actually more than just distribution of resources. Again, pulling from the idea of human freedom, but living a satisfying life where you're able to develop your human potential. And I think most of us, once we get beyond the basic instincts of food, warmth, shelter, we want some degree of satisfaction in life, and there's something inherently attractive to this. Yet, achieving that is, all of us have a role in it. It's not something we just delegate to courts and certain state institutions. Why does this matter? I think it very much speaks to that first and third dialogue again, where some elements of what is being referred to as international development are very much becoming issues of sovereign policymaking, and some of it is becoming transboundary common issues of creating global public goods. Quite frankly, I can't tell you how these are put into practice. This is the cutting edge, if you will. But I think we do have a role that we are the problem-solving, sense-making function of society, of unpacking what do we mean by social justice, and then seeing what are some of the approaches that are addressing that. So in conclusion, because I've already spoken for more than 20 minutes, what does this mean for the region, and why did I put forward a provocative title of End of Development and Beginning of History? It's an intentional play on words. Francis Fukuyama said the 1990s was the end of history, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, Ravi had a wonderful quip where he said, well, the interesting thing about the end of history is it lasted for such a short period of time. What's we're perhaps seeing more, and I think there is strong arguments for, is the end of international development as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know. Why do I say that? If you look at official development assistance, even though it may still be growing, other financial flows between countries, particularly developed and developing world, are far greater. It's a footnote, if you will, in terms of what's happening in remittances, trade, what have you. So the idea that aid dominates is no longer the case. Looking forward, actually there's been tremendous success such that there are fewer poor states, and we're probably looking at a future where official development assistance is concentrated even fewer really fragile ungoverned spaces, not spread all over the place. And I put forward, I propose, and this is Bruce's idea that you're more willing to shoot down, is that international development itself is slowly tearing into these three dialogues, the sovereign, common, and foreign issues, if you will, and indeed in many ways involving different communities on different questions. So why is it the beginning of history? I think that after, let's say, a century or more of influence, quite frankly, the West can no longer afford to intervene. We've already seen how much treasure and blood it costs to be involved in a very narrow-minded way in the region. And that's not something that the Western countries can do anymore. We've been having enough problems with our own economies, thank you. So to cite a reference here, I think we're taking Bassem Youssef's advice and saying, yeah, okay, we're willing to work in dialogue with, but no longer will you see it as the sort of dominant intervention, if you will. Already, if one looks at the headlines in Egypt, you see references to Saudi and Emirati aid being much more influential than what is the IMF or USAID doing or not doing. What I think we're going to be seeing is a future that Arab societies will be choosing for themselves, very much more, through their action or inaction, as it may be. The interesting thing, though, is the future is already here. Throughout the past number of decades, we've thought about what the future will be like. Climate change, greater drought, greater pressures on food security, certain amount of state collapse. Well, that sounds already like 2014, 2015 here. This is a region that is already facing and dealing with a context of uncertainty. And I was privileged to be here 6 months ago for the Faculty of Health Sciences conference precisely on this. You know, how do you try to keep doing professional public health in this context of chronic uncertainty? But everything is pointing to that that's the new norm, not a special time. So essentially, I'm asking us to reimagine what is international development as the question, age-old, what is the type of society that we want and we're willing to build? In this future moving forward, I think we're able to tap into learning and experience worldwide, not just in the global capitals that loomed large in the past, that were Ottawa, London, Washington. And where I see the importance of hubs like AUB in terms of now the localization of a public policy program, what does public policy mean in Lebanon and the Arab world, being part of this problem-solving and sense-making ecosystem in Beirut, Lebanon, and the region. And ultimately, to be controversial again, I would say that function, that problem-solving and sense-making function, is more influential in the long term than whatever government is in power at a given time. At a personal level, I'm trying to really understand what that means. You know, that collection of all of our policy research and efforts, and how do you assess the health of it? The Arab Council for Social Science has a monitor project that's trying to do some of this as well. And essentially, at the end of the day, it asks us a new question. It's not, you know, how many publications have I done this year? But it's asking us, you know, are we fit for purpose? To the extent that we're addressing the issues facing our society, our economies, and contributing greater insight and offering solutions. So in a certain modest way, Canada's IDRC is trying to help strengthen that function. But at the same time, we're part of a larger community or ecosystem attempting to do the same. So that concludes our remarks.
Thank you, Bruce. Dr. Samir Mahmoud.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce. And I must admit to you, I did not read the 900 pages. Especially if you gave to me only yesterday, so it was a bit difficult. But I did look at the book, and I thought that the introduction and your epilogue were extremely interesting. And I have one beginning comment. I wish it had been, you had expanded on it to capture quite a lot of what the book really has to offer, because of many excellent ideas there that one should really look at and evaluate and pose for future development and thinking. What I propose to do here is to put forth 5 observations. In a sense, the first 4 will be trying to bring out somewhat, I think, essential points in the book that will also have relevance to our own experience here in the Arab world. Because I want to connect really what you have said in the book to what we have been doing, what has been happening here in the Arab world since independence, since, in other words, Second World War. I think the first observation is that the volume really, very aptly, very forcefully, brings out this fact that, you know, development is something way beyond economics. That the economic dimension is not really any longer the thing, the core necessarily of what development is all about. It's important, but it's not the thing on which we should really focus. developmental concerns, as you put it, no longer confined to generate economic growth, per capita income, but in fact how to manage the fruits of economic growth. I think this is really the core, a very core issue of what now is happening in the literature on development. How do we invest in health, in social safety networks? How do we achieve a fairer society, a more equitable society? In fact, we are now, when we talk about development, we ask the question, how do we enrich democracy? How do we go from economic growth all the way to the issues of democracy and democratic governance? So it is not surprising, therefore, if the concept of development has expanded in this important fashion. It is not important, as again the book actually does show that there are ever-present tensions in the developmental discourse. Growth versus distribution, market versus state, what role should a state envisage, what role should it undertake in national development? This has long been a long debated controversy among economists as well as non-economists. And obviously, when you talk about what role the state should do, you are going to be talking about what are the quality of the national institutions we're talking about. When if the state is to undertake the market instead of leaving it totally to private enterprise, then do we have the quality institutions that would undertake this job adequately or appropriately? The second observation, and I think the book brings it out very nicely, is that developmental experiences teach us that the extent to which development works depends on particular local, historical, or institutional contexts. I think this is very important. And I will show you how when I talk about the Arab world. Thus, general policy prescriptions will fail if the necessary conditions that make development work are missing. You need conditions for development to work. It follows, therefore, that there is no one single recipe for development. I think the book brings out this very, very nicely. There's no one single recipe for development. Think of China, Korea, Paraguay, Lebanon, Egypt, Chile, and you find that there are special circumstances, special conditions, and in a sense, not necessarily coinciding paths of development. A fact, which in fact some of the international organizations seem to ignore or at least not pay sufficient attention to. Often people in this context refer to the IMF. And the IMF, which preaches financial policy prescriptions that critics say do not vary from one country to another. That it's a ready prescription that is taken, applied in every country, irrespective of the special circumstances of these countries. This has been taken as a critique of IMF financial policy, which they think is good for development, which governments in various countries think is not necessarily the case. In Latin America, as you probably might recall, Bruce, there was this tremendous sharp controversy. It's mentioned in the book by Raoul Prebisch, and Hans Singer and others about the structuralist school that really opposed this hegemony financial philosophy of the IMF. The structuralists, for example, approach advocated protecting national production with measured liberalization of the exchange system, whereas the IMF prescription was for an open economy and domestic financial stabilization as prerequisites for any necessary national development. My third observation is that not only have the objectives of development changed, expanded, the concept of development has expanded, but as you say, the actors have changed. And here, we are no longer, as the book says, focused on individuals, but it has shifted to groups. In tandem, of course, the role of women in development has expanded a great deal. Civil society is about what you just spoke. The role of civil society has become, that civil society has become much more engaged in terms of what development was all about and how we bring it about. At the same time, it has become increasingly recognized that developmental opportunities are constrained not only by available resources and access to finance and trade and international outlets, but also, if not more so, by established interests at home. When we talk about established interests at home, what are we talking about? We're talking about the political system and the ruling coalitions that rule the country. These are the elite, whether the business elite or the political elite. Of course, these constraints do vary from one country to another. The fourth observation is that I found that your closing observation, the closing of the volume is extremely telling. What does it say? It says that this is the conclusion of the book, that greater diversity among countries and specific developmental circumstances suggest that the era of overarching frameworks or grand theories of development, the modernization hypothesis, dependency theory, and other theories, is over. That's what you're asserting. The era of grand theories is over, because the developmental discourse itself has become wide and ambitious with multiple locations. Now, with this last observation, I come to the Arab world. Let's see how we can connect. Now, my fifth observation concerning Arab development. What is very unique about Arab development is that after the Second World War, it has amply demonstrated that, in fact, Arab development does not conform to the modernization hypothesis and the grand theory. Really, this is something of an evidence that Arab development does not conform to the modernization hypothesis. In contrast with experiences of other regions of the world, socioeconomic growth in the Arab region, post-independence, has not been accompanied by significantly greater democratic space. Now, the modernization hypothesis tells you that as you develop socioeconomically, as you have more education, as more women participate in the labor force, and so on and so forth, that the democratic space expands. This has, it is correlated, not necessarily causal, but correlated. And this has been the case in other regions of the world, except here. This has not been the case in the Arab world. Despite the fact that economic development has taken place, the space of democracy has been extremely limited and constrained. The Arab uprising, one would think, well, the Arab uprising was initiated in December 2010, are yet 20 years apart to yield, if at all, enhanced democratic governance. We are yet to see about that. Why was this the Arab experience? And I submit there are three major underlying factors that explain this phenomenon of an entrenched Arab autocracy: the abundance of our resources, a highly conflictual region, and of course, as a result, the attendant foreign interventions. Now, this does not mean that other factors, modernity, social, historical variables, do not bear on this question. They do. But on their own, they do not explain why democratic development in the Arab world has lagged so far behind, even behind sub-Saharan Africa. It is only when the impact of our resources and conflicts, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, are taken into account that we can explain why the Arab autocracy has been so entrenched and so hard to resist. The recent uprisings may have opened the door. If so, it seems to be only slightly open so far. Thus, in conclusion, perhaps one can observe that the Arab experience illustrates the notion that there is no one single set path of development, as has happened in America, Eastern Asia, Korea, Malaysia, and so on. And that institutions and special circumstances play a crucial role in determining the political-economic trajectory of individual countries and regions. Indeed, the Arab experience seems to corroborate the view that you have advocated, that grand theorist development seems to be on the decline. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir and Bruce. And we will now open it up to comments, questions, observations. But if you would just identify yourself, and if you're asking a question, ask a question. If you're making a comment, make a comment, but not to make it too long so we can get a lot of interaction.
Thank you very much. My name is Adil Cortaz, former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. Well, I like this presentation, and I give credit to Issam Affairs Institute, and I encourage you to have more of these dialogues, these interventions. What I heard from the two speakers, we did not pay attention or put more emphasis on growth, because this is the first priority either for my country, Lebanon, or for the Arab countries. Economic growth would come first in the priorities before social development and social justice. If we are speaking about intra-regional trade among the Arab countries, it's not more than 10%. It is because the capacity of these member countries in the Arab states is not there to increase the employment, increase income, and reduce unemployment in the member countries of the Near East, the Arab world. My second point is related to women in development. We cannot imagine that half of the society in the Arab world is really not really employed. It's not participating enough in development. Therefore, this is the second point on which you have to put more emphasis. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Amen. And then I think you amen. And then,
I did not support the vote now, but I wonder why the oath does not have a number of more than 1, 2, 3. For instance, economic development alone, social, cultural factors alone, university education, all that alone. You could have got 3 volumes out of that. Now, students cannot carry this. Just need reference. So, money more. I'm sure that no American publishing house would have published this book. They would have to read 700 pages.
thank you.
Okay, that's my from marketing point of view.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Wayne Professional Life Sciences. My point to Bruce, and I think that's an interesting sort of presentation. You're talking about the mine and the hours, and then the theirs when you talk about sort of these 3 levels. And it's difficult to sort of grasp everything that you have presented. But I have difficulty with the sort of accepting this categorization and separation of the national, transborder, and then the foreign, especially when we think of the Arab world. To think of development at the national level without considering transborder and the context of the region, which I understand is the foreign, is the conflicts and the wars and the things that are happening somewhere else, or the failing state. I think when you come to the Arab region, you find that you cannot separate the 3 from each other. You cannot see what's happening in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq as a national failure of a national development project. It's more as a failure of a regional development project, or even a failure of a global development project. And so I find it difficult to engage for any of the countries in the Arab region. And I think we'll be repeating the mistake, and I might look sort of nostalgic to the days of Arab unity and working together. But I think the more we observe what's really happening around us, the more convincing it is to all of us that not a single country in this region can survive on its own. And what's really happening in different countries is a reflection of a regional thing. If I followed your thinking properly, so look at the case of Yemen now. I wonder whether we could talk about a national development project, assume the war stops now, assume whatever Yemeni government takes over and everything, and everybody loves everyone in the country. Nothing is going to move without some kind of an agreement that is regional and with clear intervention at the political level and economic level from positive and negative global. So maybe I didn't follow well, but can you sort of address this tension from the national transborder? You refer to it as the foreign and the theirs, but the examples you used were actually applicable to us, failing states and conflicts and wars. So how do you sort of manage these three levels when you're thinking of development?
Okay. We'll take one more, Carmen, and then we'll get comments and come back from the other end.
Yeah, Carmen Jeha, Department of Political Science and Public Administration here at AUB. In the spirit of getting away from grand economic theories, I have sort of a simple question. What do you think of the rise of social enterprises in the region as a replacement of advocacy, charity, so income generating organizations that also solve social problems? Is it better to keep on advocating, so think tanks should keep on thinking and NGOs should keep on raising awareness, or is it better that we find innovative solutions to water poverty, refugees, and start implementing them and scale them?
Fantastic. Minister, this question of growth versus equity deserves its own session, and indeed we had one in December with the Economic Research Forum in Cairo, where we had a debate with 4 individuals. The entire video is available through this website and on YouTube. And it is much more complex than nuanced, and there are strong arguments on either side. I think the actual balance at the end of the day is what Samir was referring to. You know, each society is somewhat unique in its conditions and its priorities, and what is it one before the other, or in conjunction in what terms? So if you'll indulge me, I think I can see the debate because that was fun. This is a very sort of stoic format where we're saying, you know, here's a presentation, Q&A. In that case, the speakers were actually trying to attack each other. It was kind of fun. In terms of women, you're absolutely right. And 2 insights into the production of this volume. Early on, I almost resigned from it because, quite frankly, 4 guys talking about development as the editors, and I felt, no, you know, we needed, just for the sake of diversity of insights, a woman on the editorial team for it. I was convinced to carry on with it. We did struggle for a while, saying we'll make sure it's very implicit for each set of authors that the perspective of gender and where do women, how do they experience these topics differently, fit in. We realized that sort of mainstream approach was not sufficient. So we did have a topic that was just on women's experience in development, and we had two writers involved in that, and they themselves have different views, but at least you try to see both the networking, the mainstream through each of the chapters, trying to refer to the experience of women in Indian development, if you will, plus having a chapter on its own and reaching out to female authors. Could we have done more? Yes. In terms of why, you know, this brick, the yellow brick, and not several different volumes. The initial discussion with the press Oxford was saying, well, could this be the handbook? You know, that's their model of having these sort of handbooks on development economics, what have you. It fell a little bit short of becoming a handbook on international development or development thinking. It ended up with its own title, but once you sort of open it up, look through it, it's kind of like that. But we're also living in an age when the book is no longer just the only product. Actually, the product is mostly the chapters. So if somebody's putting together a course on development in the Arab region or development economics, whatever, they will pick and choose a few different chapters. And in the modern age, a lot of our students are going online and through the library website accessing the electronic text they need. We've sort of invented that. We also have the full text available that way. I don't expect there is a single person alive that has read the book from cover to cover, nor is it intended to do that. You dip into it, and as I've said to colleagues, it's on the one side, if you know this particular topic very well, if you know development economics, if you know about women and gender issues, you read that chapter, you'll get a good overview, but you may not learn anything new. If you've never experienced anything about water, rural development, global health, you dip into that chapter and you come away going, okay, I kind of understand it now. The ideas at play, how they've changed over time, where's this field going? That was the intention. Yes, my apologies, I forgot to mention for the brevity of the presentation. Small states are a special category, and this was brought out in the workshops we had with authors, that if you're Lebanon or Jordan, your opportunities for domestic policymaking are much more constrained than if you're Brazil or India. So that being a sort of special reality on its own, such that the mind and hours get sort of interplayed, and the space for independent thinking in action is a little bit more constrained. I would still posit that on any of these issues, though, there is a tension between the mind and hours. That the region has some elements of the cross-boundary, where we need to coordinate action, but also when you're talking about, let's say, healthcare in Lebanon, it's a discussion that involves the ministry, clinics, the medical profession, that may not be completely regional. There is still a certain amount of the community, whether it's the epistemic community or the practice, is still grounded within a national context, even if that is conditioned by the regional one. For myself, and again, speaking for myself and not IDRC or my co-editors, I'm increasingly thinking about the region and many parts of the developing world not as nation states, these colored pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but as the urban centers and emanating out from that. I was born and raised in Canada. If you're living on the border in the prairies, you may feel closer to the Midwestern states than you do to Ottawa or Toronto. I think the same happens in this region, that your experience as a citizen, if you're in the urban center, your availability and quality of healthcare is different than if you're in this sort of concentric circle, this fuzzy boundary out from urban centers where that's where the real sort of gravity of governments and societies are. So again, if you're in Aswan, you may feel a little bit of affinity for Sudan across the border, rather than only exclusively looking towards Cairo.
Is okay, just to clarify that, because that links a bit to what Dr. Makdisi also talked about. I'm just thinking of and I don't want to take the region and use it always as an exception, but Dr. Makdisi said it is an exception, that this is the only place where you had socio-economic development and no democracy. And now this is a place where the national political borders are falling. You talk about the healthcare system as an example, and we're arguing actually. And we have colleagues that are researching this issue, that this whole idea of a national healthcare system doesn't work in this region anymore, because you have the Iraqi Syrians and Lebanese Palestinians sort of moving from one country to the other, and the access to services is regional, no more national. And you cannot think in national development without taking into consideration the situation. And that links to a certain extent to what Dr. Maqdisi has referred to. Is this a sort of a unique, exceptional model that's happening in the Arab region, or at least our sub-region of the Arab world? Or it's, I don't know, I can't figure that out. Do we have our own development project? Is it all about exceptions in this region? What's not working? And so it is a case study that needs to be either normalized or then sort of deconstructed to understand what's happening. And I don't know what it's just as simple.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the issue of sort of populations on the move, and how that is one of the things that's driving that a lot of the issues we talk about in development are either beyond or beneath the nation state. Last, I just wanted to touch on this. Great comment. I mean, I forgot to mention social business and social enterprise as part of the sort of current thinking within development. And I think there's a lot of potential there. It's a lot of potential that has yet to be tapped into and realized. There is a part of me, though, that wonders what the limits of business thinking are for these sort of taboo, wicked problems. I mean, where is the social business that ends sexual or gender-based violence? Where's the social business that reduces illicit trade in drugs and arms? So I think it will work for some things. It will not work for all things. But that being said, let it thrive. Jocelyn, you want to? Is this a hot pursuit?
Sorry.
Or maybe is it related to what?
Yes, it's related to this comment.
Okay, comment,
So
and then we'll come to Sabi.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment that I think it's interesting that someone based in the Middle East is writing on development, because historically the Middle East has been totally absent from the development studies field. So, I mean, I did my master's in development studies in the UK, and we never learned anything about the Middle East because it was never included, it was never considered. Voices from the Middle East were never part of the debate. So I'm interested in your observations about why that is so, and if that is changing after the Arab Spring and other. I see it happening in corners. That there's more because I think a lot of the questions about Arab exceptionalism, etc. Part of that is because it's never put in a wider framework. I mean, many of the political and economic problems we face in this region are not unique to this region, but they're not often put in an international development framework. So, I wonder if you had any comments on that.
I think I'll hold off for the next round.
Well, very quickly, on the answer to Adi, I mean, the idea was not to emphasize economic growth. I think the idea to emphasize was that development is beyond what was economic growth. I mean, this multidisciplinary nature of development. I think this is what was behind this whole discourse. And as for the role of women, I think this is becoming increasingly important in the literature on development. I think there's a whole, I'm sure we should know a lot. About this. On Iman, one comment on what you said, the business of the Arab unity. There's no question that things are interconnected. And you cannot talk about individual national development without reference to others. And that's what in literature they call neighborhood effect. Now, it could be regional neighborhood effect, it could be world neighborhood effect, whatever it is. I mean, I think this is an established fact. Now, but on the question of Arab unity, the question we should ask ourselves, why was this never materialized? Why did it never come to fruition? And, I mean, this will take a long time to discuss it, but I think the basic elements of the fact that this is a region that has abundance of oil resources, the oil effect, what we call in the literature, the oil curse. Now, it could be a blessing in certain respects, but politically it has had it is an oil curse, Plus the fact that you have conflicts, very high incidence of conflicts that have acted as constraints to the Arab governments coming together. Had these problems been resolved, I'm sure that the interconnectedness you're talking about would have been much, much stronger and much more emphatic.
Any other comments, questions? Later?
I have a question about, I don't think it was addressed as much like relative deprivation. So yes, people are not poor anymore, but the inequality in society is I mean, I'm referring to some of Thomas Piketty's work, which was criticized, but you see that a lot of people have moved out of poverty, but a lot of people, but the gap between them and those that have and have-nots have also become bigger. So is there something as a relative development? Who's getting developed and who's development working for? Is it enough for people to move out of poverty? Or is it enough for them to move out of poverty in a kind of in a way that is coherent with how the entire society is moving towards wealth?
I'd like to ask a question that kind of follows up on that in one way, which is from your extensive experiences in putting together this volume and the many discussions you've had and your own experience, who decides the priorities of development? Who decides whether you want to look at gender issues, environmental issues, growth issues, poverty reduction? There's such a vast range of issues that need to be addressed, and they're interrelated, we know that. But somebody must at some point say, limited government resources are going to go into, girls' education or water resources improvement or whatever. So the decision-making process, prioritizing developmental goals, what have you learned from that? What can you tell us about that? Okay. Floor is yours.
Wow, no pressure. Johnson, you're right, and I don't have a simple answer. It doesn't matter to a large extent which issue we're talking about within development studies. Voices from the Arab world seem to be relatively absent. I don't have a simple explanation for it, except that there are points of light. I think on the climate file, for example, you're seeing a stronger presence. Where there may be, and this is coming from the outside, an observation, a preoccupation of speaking within the region rather than being connected to some of the global debates, and particularly those that are no longer controlled by a few, if you will. So I think climate's a good one where every country and society has some responsibility and will experience some impact. There isn't sort of a controlling coalition of those setting the terms of the agenda, if you will, to refer to Rami's point. I don't really have an explanation for it, but hopefully that's changing, and I think it is. Leila, on relative deprivation, I think you've hit the nail on the head. That is one of the critical issues of what we've called development until now is now grappling with. To a certain extent, we can almost say, for a large number of countries at the global stage, mission accomplished. Did we reduce poverty by half over the past 20 years? Yeah. Now, was it mostly China? Yeah. This ambitious goal of saying, well, let's now eradicate absolute poverty. Fine, but does that create a utopia? No. We're already experiencing the issue of, yes, okay, maybe everybody's been getting richer, but those that were really well off have really been growing even faster. So this sense of society itself tearing apart, gated communities where people are sort of closing themselves off and not feeling like a part of society, but to be able to walk the streets and cohabitate with their fellow citizens, that's a problem. And it's a problem in Canada, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. So Piketty galvanized the community in a way that we weren't able to do with this volume. And he has been critiqued, but the important issue is there, because this is now one of the defining questions. Which brings back to yourself. I mean, what are who decides the issues? For this volume and its structure, the four of us did. We sat together and we had multiple lists, and we knocked things on and we put things on, and you can critique what was included and what was not included. And indeed, at one point there was a suggestion of, well, let's do another 2 volumes and with other topics and what have you. I think one person generously stated, this is a great summary of how thinking on development was by about 2012. We're now into a new space. And that new space is precisely this openness to the experiences of others. You know, what is development is no longer decided in Toronto, New York, and I'll pick on London and Paris again. You know, what is happening in Seoul, Beirut, Rio de Janeiro? You know, these are places that are increasingly influential in setting those terms, and you are getting, as Samir picked up very well, you know, these different, more localized agendas. You know, what matters for African development? What matters for Asian development? There are certain commonalities, but again, the ranking and prioritization will be slightly different. There has been, and I've been a part of the process, the national policy making. You know, what are Canada's key development priorities? And you may see those reset over time with different governments. A certain amount of consistency, though, because they reflect the particular values of the society that's in the giving role. But that is currently being much more nuanced and mediated because there's no longer this simple dynamic of aid givers and receivers. It is very much more influential these days. What a national government, a society decides is in its own interests. So even as early with the beginning of the MDGs, you saw the importance of poverty reduction strategies that were supposed to be designed by the countries themselves. Okay, some of them were designed by foreign consultants that came in and wrote it for them, but the intention was there, that you can have your own set of priorities, how you see the world from your capital, your head office. But that is the beginning of a discussion with the society. So, you know, as IDRC or Canada coming into Lebanon, we can say, these are the areas we're interested in. Now, how does that match with what you're interested in? So it becomes much more of a dialogue. I think there is a key role, however, for being able to inform and shape that debate, whether in Ottawa or Beirut, by those in the room, if you will, those in civil society, in academics and research that are really trying to contribute to our sense of what are the key problems, where are the moments for creating leverage on them, and just sense making. How do we understand the emerging world? I think some of the language we've used in development isn't necessarily helpful for understanding the current reality of populations on the move and health dynamics across borders. I mean, how the special issue of the Lancet was proposing even new language and concepts. That's a critical function, and that speaks again to that how do we understand way of influencing policy.
Quick answer to Leila. I mean, I think that moving out of poverty does not necessarily mean lesser inequality. I mean, you could have richer countries that are more unequal and then poorer countries that are more equal. So I think the two are not, they could be related, but not necessarily so. So the two are two separate concepts there.
Well, these are issues that we are going to be exploring in our social justice and development policy program over the next 2 or 3 years, and we welcome more involvement by all of you and many others. And what we're particularly interested in is understanding the whole range of issues that matter to people in their daily lives, material issues like water and housing and jobs and food, and value-based issues or intangible issues like voice, accountability, corruption, respect, dignity, and how these two match. So you might have some people with very low incomes, poor people, who are living a life that is not necessarily volatile and dangerous. They have other factors in their community that help them somehow get through life in a reasonable way. And then you have other wealthy people who are out there demonstrating in the streets for something else. So we want to understand the relationships between the material and the intangible elements that people that shape people's lives and how they see themselves in society. Are they being treated fairly by their own country? Leave apart, you know, Israeli colonization and Western armies and drones, just their own societies, how they're treated in their own countries, to be able to try to help come up with ideas for governments, private sector. I mean, the role of the private sector in issues of social justice are enormous when you look at housing, water, education, healthcare, food provision. The private sector may play a bigger role than the governments in all of these areas. So we will keep working on this, and we thank you for coming. I want to thank Leila Abilan and Sarah Jamal, our two staff members on the Social Justice Program, for their good work on this, and thank Bruce and Samir for speaking, and thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.